So this morning we're going to do another grid painting based on this picture of apples in the orchard. We'll be constructing a grid painting rather like the one here, and we are going to approach it slightly differently from the way we did last week, but we're going to follow many of the same steps. So it's kitchen gardens, and we're going to be looking at greens. We're going to be looking at dark on light, we're going to be looking at the grid structure, and we're going to be looking at positive and negative. So the first thing that you want to do is basically just gather your materials. I've gridded out my picture, and you're going to do the same too. You're going to grid out your watercolor paper. Last week I suggested with the grid that you just plunge in ahead and don't do any pencil drawing. But for this week, I think it's helpful to actually have a little bit of a pencil drawing in to refer to. So I have lightly drawn in the twigs and the apples. And once I've drawn them in, I actually go over with an eraser and just lighten everything up so that I don't get too much graphite in with my watercolor. Now, although the picture is on a horizontal axis, I've chosen to do a vertical one just because I think it's more interesting. But that is totally up to you. And I'm also taking a little bit of creative license with the placement of my apples. I'm going to start grid by grid, just filling in the background and painting around the apples. So I'm going to take a nice green color and paint in my first square, or my first rectangle. And because I'm going to paint over it, I want to keep it relatively light. So I'm going to paint just that first grid. And then because it's very wet, I'm going to paint another grid that doesn't touch. And I'm going to just vary the greens a little in each. So here I'm going to paint around the twigs and the apples. And I'm going to gradually fill in all of the background grid. So we're going to start like this. And often I'll mix a little bit of this yellow, this lovely sort of sour lemon, number 40, into the green. So I'm gradually filling in the greens. You can leave a little bit of space if you want between your grid, or you can tuck up each square so they're touching. Up to you. All the sections are painted in and it's pretty wet, so unfortunately you're going to have to step away, check your email, let it dry, and come back to it in a few minutes. Okay, so a quick check to make sure it's all dry, and it is just about. So I'm going to start to put in the branches and the twigs, and I'm going to use my favorite silvery brown grey, which is the Periwinkle 61 and 47, the Van Dyke Brown. So I'm going to mix a little bit of that in and start to put in the branches and the twigs. And as you go down, you might want to mix in a tiny bit of 46 to the burnt sienna into your twig. So you can see how mine is coming down. And as I get to the end of the section, maybe I just change that recipe, put in a little bit more lavender or a little bit more brown, but something that's just a little different. And over it comes over here. So now I'm going to put in the support for the leaves. So I test on a piece of scrap paper to make sure I can get a nice fine line. And on they start to come. And I don't need to do too many, but it just gives me an idea of where some of my leaves are going to go. Before I start painting in the leaves, I like to actually pre-moisten the greens that I'm going to be picking up. I don't know if you can see, probably not, but I put a little puddle of water on some of them so that it's easy to pick up the green and I don't have to scrub for it. Some lovely dark luscious greens, and I'm working pretty wet. Reach a break in a grid, then I leave a tiny little bit of space in between, and then I just carry on the leaf over into the next section. I've got just a few of my leaves in and I can't resist. I have to go in and start painting the apples. The apples, I'm going to use a combination of colour. I typically start with number 43, which is a slightly warm yellow, and it goes in. And then I bleed in some pink, and that might be number 35. I build up my apples just by varying the yellows. Just keep going, and if the paint looks too muddy, just rinse off your brush. Everything is pretty wet, so I'm going to take a 2-minute break, and then I'm going to come back when it's all a tiny bit dry. Apples are all in, and you can see where some of them are behind. I've gone a little bit darker by adding alizarin crimson to the mix. So now I'm going to just go in and put lots more leaves in and put some decoration on the apple. I want the area of greatest interest to be round my clump of apples here, and I also want to bring out these wonderful insect bites in the leaf. So that's what I'm going to do. Trying to capture some bend in the leaf to make it lifelike too. Base of the apple, I take a little bit of burnt sienna and a little bit of Van Dyke brown, and I just draw around it, maybe 3/4 of the way, just like that. So I get the base of the apple. And I don't have to put it on apples a little bit more, excuse me, a little bit more shape. So I'm going to take some pink on my brush and I'm going to put some flecks on the apple. And I want the flecks or the strokes to follow the contour of the apple so that they'll suggest its roundness. And you don't have to do too many, but you just want a couple so that it starts to give that nice shape to the apple. You can see how these shapes reinforce the roundness of the fruit. Apples are starting to take shape very nicely. Now, if you look at the photo, you'll see not only do you have the leaves in the front, but you have a lot of variation in the background. So we're going to put in some of the background variation too to make it a more interesting image. Now I'm going to add in some of these sort of abstract shapes, particularly toward the center of the piece, just to reinforce the image and make the background a little bit more exciting. So at the end, I like to go back in with these little pinpoints of color just for emphasis around the main image. Now, this is a long project. It's taken me most of the morning to paint this. I could add a few more areas of green. In fact, I probably will on either side, but I don't want to make this video too long. But I hope that when you try this or something similar, you'll settle back with a nice cup of coffee or a nice cup of tea, a good podcast, piece of music, and enjoy. And just think about positive, negative shapes. Think about playing with your greens and just lose yourself in the artwork. So thanks so much and see you soon.